so can you tell us a little bit about revelation and how that's supposed to work?
Sure. Yeah. So revelation is the idea that being conscious tells you what consciousness is. By having an experience, you are put in a position to grasp something like its nature. Maybe not the whole nature of everything to do with it, but at least the nature of what that experiential quality is like. So when I see something red, I know what it's like to see red. I may not know everything there is to know about that, but I know what defines that experiential type. And this idea that there's some kind of genuine grasping of nature is, I think, fairly important to the arguments against physicalism.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Philip said that. He's developed that line of thought at length. But it does look like it's potentially a problem for constitutive panpsychists, because they are saying, look, when you have an experience, there's a lot going on there that you don't know about, namely, a trillion simpler experiences, or aspects of a trillion simpler experiences kind of blended together. And so what I try to do in the book, and at a bit more length in the paper, is try to diffuse this threat. In particular, I try to say, well, there's I guess a few kind of twists and turns the argument can take, but the basic idea is, you do have genuine knowledge of the nature of the complex quality. You know what it's like to see red. What seeing red is in general. You don't know what on this occasion gives rise to that experience. You don't have insight into what constitutes this particular instance of seeing red.
Right.
But what that means is that you are being acquainted with the nature of this quality. You are in a position that if you're acquainted with or familiar with the nature of some other things, you should be in a position to tell whether or not they are enough to explain it. And that's why this kind of substantiates the argument against physicalism, because physicalism, requires us to, in some sense, know what it is about the physical that explains consciousness. And so all you need is acquaintance with the nature of, say, seeing red, to be able to evaluate, does this complicated physical arrangement, is that the right kind of thing to explain this? And that does leave it open, I think, for the constitutive panpsychist to say, the red in this case is constituted by a lot of simpler qualities, and we don't know those distinctly. We don't have, them in isolation. So in a sense, we can't actually perform this evaluation of whether they are enough to explain the redness. But we don't have the argument against panpsychism analogous to the argument against physicalism, because panpsychists, in a sense, are almost defined by saying there is something at the fundamental level that eludes our scientific grasp. There's something there that we don't have a grasp on, except that we know it's something like what we ourselves experience. So I guess
I find that pretty puzzling, because, well, for a couple of reasons. First, the argument against physicalism, because it seems like the physicalists could do the same thing and say, well, what we know is the experiential nature of the property. And that's what I think, actually. But that doesn't mean you know what its metaphysical nature is. Its metaphysical nature may be neurons or fundamental properties of atoms that are conscious. So how do you preserve, I guess one thing I was curious about is how you preserve the argument against physicalism and against this kind of move, which I was just trying to make. Go ahead,
well, so I think it's correct to say in that instance that we don't know, just through the revelation principle, we don't know the constituents or the basis of our particular experience of red on a given occasion.
Right.
What we know is what it is for an experience to be of red.
Right.
And that, I was saying, is enough for us to make arguments of the form, here's a candidate explainer. Is this the right kind of thing to explain why we would have an experience of red? And my claim essentially is that panpsychism has, you might say, a greater epistemic humility about the fundamental level, or it has a picture of the fundamental level that has more space for things that we aren't acquainted with.
Right.
In a way that kind of, I think, would in some ways defeat the motivation for physicalism. Physicalists will sometimes say things like, oh, perhaps there's some mysterious feature of the physical that we don't know about yet. But that is kind of the first step, towards something closer to panpsychism, that kind of non-standard physicalism.
Yeah,
on which
like Barbara Montero's.
Yeah, like the sort of view on which there's something else, beyond what physics says. There's something else about the fundamental nature of things that, if we understood it, would allow us to understand why we're conscious.
Right. But what I guess I'm confused about is why we need that as physicists. Why isn't it enough to say that revelation tells us about the experiential nature of the property, but not about what metaphysically it is? And then it's a further separate question about what that is, and you can give arguments that it's physical or not. But I'm not sure why revelation by itself then has any relevance to physicalism.
So I think maybe we're drawing slightly different distinctions here.
Okay.
So I was distinguishing between the particular things that constitute a given instance of an experience, like me seeing red right now. And I was contrasting that with the property of having an experience of redness in general.
Right.
And it sounds like you are trying to pull apart two aspects of that second thing, an experiential nature of the property in general and a metaphysical nature of the property in general.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure what that means really, because I would have thought that, it's an experiential property. So its experiential nature just is its nature. That's what it is to be an experiential property, is to feel a certain way. So I guess I'm sort of, I'm not sure what the.
Well, why aren't you doing the same thing? I mean, I see your point here, but why isn't it the same for you, given that the ultimate nature of it is composites in this way?
So because I take that to be a claim about the bases of a particular instance.
Right.
So one of the things that this does commit me to is the idea that you could have different beings in different possible worlds that all have the same experiential quality, that all see redness.
Right.
But one of them is perhaps a Cartesian soul, for which the redness property is not grounded in anything else. That's just the basic fact about it.
Right.
And maybe for us, the panpsychist thinks it's grounded in a certain set of simpler experiences together. Maybe in another universe, it's grounded in a different set of simple experiences together. And each of these has to be such that a subject who fully grasped the simple experiences could tell that they generate redness. That link, it has to be intelligible, but it may be a many-one relation.
So how is it? But I must be.
But I think the key thing that maybe is dividing us is that my distinction is between particular instances, concretely,
right,
and the property as a universal. And it sounds like you're trying to pull apart two aspects of the property as a universal.
Well, I was thinking of the instance, like a particular instance of experiencing red. So I do think some kind of revelation thesis is true about that thing's experiential nature, but I don't think that tells you. I mean, certainly doesn't tell you that if idealism is true or not.
Mhm.
It doesn't tell you whether panpsychism is true or not. Just knowing what it's like to see red in a given particular instance
Mhm.
doesn't reveal the metaphysical basis of that particular experience.
But do you
Otherwise,
think
all we
it,
have to do is introspect and rule out idealism. But that we can't do that.
so I guess I think that it puts you in a position to evaluate candidate explanations. It doesn't tell you what the specific explanation of that instance is, but it puts you in a position to evaluate candidate explanations if you fully understand them.
Yeah, I guess
And
I don't see that move.
okay,
I mean, I guess that's where you just say conceivability arguments and things like that. That's where the evaluation of those candidates comes in.
yeah, exactly.
Right. So we disagree there. But so okay, because the reason I brought up Revelation was that I thought that this is an argument against panpsychism. But the way you phrased it just now was very careful, obviously, because you didn't say we know everything there is to know about it. We just know what it's like to see red, which could turn out to be a composite thing on your view. So then what we know is like what it's like to have a composite experience. But I hear like other versions of this that are much more specific and say things like, well, Revelation tells us everything there is to know about red in the experiencing of it. We know everything there is to know about it. And you can't endorse that.
Well, I think again it matters a lot whether that is everything there is to know about my particular experience of red right now, which is a concrete thing, has a spatiotemporal location, and it arises from particular bases and from particular causes, or if it means everything there is to know about the property in general, which usually I take it there's a restriction to everything that is essential to it, everything that is, that defines what that sort of experience is. Because this usually goes with, quite a fairly narrow view of what that is, namely that it's feeling like this. It's this kind of phenomenal quality. I mean, I think Philip has sort of a maneuver here where he says, look, if you think that there's something else that's essential to the property in general of seeing red, I'm just talking about the aspect that we do grasp via this revelation, the aspect that we are acquainted with. That's what I mean by the reddish, the reddishness of red. And you can kind of iterate it a few times, I guess, the reddish quality of the reddishness of red. But if you want to say there's something that you're acquainted with. And I think that even if it's only a tiny sliver of the reality that's going on here, inside my skull, what's important is that it can still put you in a position to evaluate candidate explanations.
Did it put you in a position to know that there are micro subjects?
No.
So
I'm not sure that I do know that there are micro subjects. I consider it the most likely hypothesis, but I am in the position of having to hypothesize.
I guess what I'm asking is, why doesn't the revelation thesis commit you to knowing that? And since you don't, isn't that a strike against the view?
So, right. So the revelation thesis commits me to knowing everything that's essential to the property, in the abstract of seeing red, of having that kind of experience.
Right.
And
not about the instance.
Not about the instance. And so I think that the essence of that property is, in a certain sense, multiply realizable, multiply constitutable. It could arise from certain combinations of micro experiences or from certain other combinations, or it could exist all by itself. I don't think it could arise purely from non-phenomenal facts in any concatenation.
So you really have to deny even the conceivability of anti-zombies or zombies, and I don't really see an argument for that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, going to go back to our earlier dispute about what's built into saying nothing but.
Right.
I mean, it may also turn somewhat on what we mean by physical. So I said earlier that panpsychists see themselves as kind of filling in the intrinsic natures of physical things.
Right.
And so there is a sense in which, maybe it is possible to conceive of schmombies, they're just physical and they're conscious. but maybe by doing so, what you're conceiving of is things that have, you know, the full nature of what in our universe is physical. They have, you know, all of this that I've got.
And that's cheating because they have a
well, that's going to turn
particles.
physicalism into a sort of panpsychism.
Yeah,
Well, it will make physicalism into panpsychism if panpsychism is true in the actual universe.
right. Yeah, no, I think that the way I conceive of them is they don't have that. They're just physical, but they're conscious, like in a non-fundamental way. You know, like in a good old-fashioned, it's just the brain sort of way. But yeah, all right, I can see that's a complicated schlag, and we don't need.
Yeah, when you're stipulating the fundamentality, I think you're stipulating something about like the metaphysical dependence relations. And I think that involves you in making claims not just about the particular possible world that you're imagining, but more broadly about how other possible worlds relate to it.
Yeah, I guess I don't see that, but that's not.
I'm happy to agree to disagree.
Yeah, totally. Everyone disagrees with me, so that's fine. Yeah, but I still don't. I guess. Yeah, exactly. You have it even worse than I do, I think, with this combined mind stuff. Which, but you do. By the end, it's hard to disagree because you do such a good job defending it. But I still don't see why the revelation thesis doesn't apply to a particular instance. So I guess I'm curious why you restrict it only to the property type, as opposed to my given instantiation of that type. Like when I experience the red, shouldn't I know everything that, you know, by you know, forming a pure, direct, phenomenal concept, whatever one you like, and I think you like pure, and some people like direct, whatever. So you form that kind of concept. There it is. I know everything that there is about this is, but you can't say that. Or is this where the confusion is going to come in? So I guess I'm waiting for confusion to play a role in the argument.
So there are these other epistemic intuitions that we have a sort of special contact with our particular experiences, that we're aware of them in a especially direct way.
Right.
I guess I don't see a reason for thinking that this is going to extend to like a grasp of their full essence or all their properties. You know, I'd be open to hearing an argument along those lines. And to a certain extent, you know, I will own up that I'm, you know, my goal here is sort of to find a consistent corner of logical space. And I'm not sure if it will necessarily be the best motivated one overall. But I think there is a consistent corner here. But you're right that there's this other thing that's often bundled in with talk of revelation, that if I'm having an experience, I should be able to kind of fix on it and know it. And so, yeah, so it probably is useful to talk a bit about confusion. And we've already talked a bit about the idea of one phenomenal quality being blended out of all these others.
Right.
And that blending is what I'm calling confusion, which again, I think is
right. It's that we can't separate them. They're blended in a way that's not separable.
Exactly. So, and I want to insist that we are having all of the experiences, but we're having them together in this way that kind of doesn't tell us how many of them there are. And I do take this from Leibniz and Spinoza to some extent, who are very into this idea that, you know, the mind has many very simple perceptions, but it's kind of got them all blurred together. And I think that is usefully thought of to some extent in attentional terms. So I have, you know, a lot of experiences, but there's a limit to how much I can attend to them individually. I can kind of shine the spotlight of attention on certain kind of groupings, but not on, I can't kind of penetrate more finely than that. And then that puts a limit on which phenomenal qualities I can know the essence of, or the natures. So I'm using nature and essence synonymously. I probably should pick one and stick with it.
Or pick both and stick with both.
Okay.
So can I, because this is another question, because attention is a functional notion. It's one of the easy problems, right? So it's not a phenomenal thing. So I am confused a little bit about
Mhm.
how something that's not phenomenal can play this kind of role on your view.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, I think when Dave distinguishes the hard problem and the easy problems, um, I think he does, recognize that a lot of the times, something that we have a word for, like attention or like really consciousness itself, is going to be a word that kind of straddles both sides. So there's a functional notion of attention, and there's a phenomenal notion of attention, just like there's a functional notion of awareness and a phenomenal notion of awareness. Um, and so you can kind of pull them apart if you really want to just focus on, say, the functional notion. If you want to study that, and not have to worry about phenomenology and get these metaphysicians off my back. Just do the cognitive science of attention. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that what's going on there is that there are two different kind of separable properties, and you're just studying the one and not the other. I think it maybe makes more sense to say something like the functional notion of attention is a functional role, and in us, the playing of that role is by phenomenal dynamics. And so what we, in everyday language, what we mean when we say attention is the way that the attentional role is played within phenomenal consciousness. And that's going to be kind of a notion that blends together some of the phenomenal with the functional kind of skeleton. The phenomenal is what fleshes out or fills in the phenomenal outline. I guess you don't actually, do you flesh out a skeleton? I don't know.
So, but that's a high level property of the brain.
Yeah.
And so how is that blended out of, I mean, I guess, so this gets to the other thing I want to ask is how does the blending work to give me, because part of the I don't know if since revelation, you want to reserve that for property types, the graspingness or whatever of phenomenal properties is their simplicity, right? That phenomenal red is simple in a sense when I focus on it. And I just don't understand how, even if you buy the entire story, which I find semi-convincing, by the way, more than I should, given that I'm not a panpsychist. But even if you buy that entire story, I don't see how that gives you, from these tiny little elements, anything that could ever amount to red. So I just don't see how and in that part of the book, I felt like I didn't get an answer to this. Okay. It's probably because I need to read it 6 more times. But so anyway, how do we get human level consciousness from the confusion, blending, all these things?
So part of what I guess I'm trying to draw on is the thought that we have some cases within our macro level consciousness where we have an experience at one time, and then maybe, and at that time, it seems like it's just one quality. It doesn't come to us as composite or as having dissociable elements. And then maybe later on, we have a different experience and we realize, oh, that was an element of the previous experience. And maybe we have a third experience, we're like, oh, that was the other element. And now we have the first experience again. And because we've kind of trained ourselves to recognize these two elements, we can be like, oh, now it actually seems phenomenologically composite to me. Right. People will talk, I mean, I think Daniel Dennett in Consciousness Explained, he talks about this with notes on a guitar.
Right.
And I don't really get that particular example because I'm terrible at recognizing notes. I'm kind of tone deaf, but people will also talk about this in terms of smells and flavors. And there's potentially there might be examples with color. There's some, I think, intuition to the effect that, that orange kind of recognizably contains red and yellow as elements. But if you just saw orange and you had never seen red and yellow, you wouldn't be able to kind of see it as having the like any redness to it or any yellowness to it.
Explain other colors like I mean, purple and orange work, but green.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, to me, I think green feels bluish and yellowish. But the primary colors, red, green, red, yellow, and blue, right. They don't seem to be blended. Sorry?
I don't get that for green, just personally. Not that it matters,
Fair enough.
but I could see how how you could. But it does seem weird to say that it's literally that they're both there as opposed to they're blended. So purple seems like a reddish blue, but it doesn't seem like red and blue.
I mean, to some extent, I may just have to kind of lean harder on the intuition here. I mean, what would it be like if you did experience red and blue together at the same location in phenomenal space? To me, the best answer seems to be purple.
Yeah.
I mean, color is tricky. Like, color processing is really, in some respects, is very counterintuitive. You know, which colors actually combine with which other ones when you're dealing with like wavelengths and tones. And so I don't want to lean too hard on the particular examples. I think in some ways, flavor and smell is more useful just for kind of pushing this sense that sometimes we have experiences that are other things blended together, and they comprise these different elements, but we don't automatically recognize them as comprising those many elements.
Now, let's not even talk about yellow, but I think flavor is an interesting case because I know it's, you know, has inputs from taste and also smell, but it's an open question whether it's a unique state, multimodal sometimes they call it, which is more than just a blending of them. It becomes something else, like unique and distinct, which is formed maybe out of those two elements. But so I'm not sure if I really get the intuitions that you're leaning on here, because it sounds like what you're committed to is that if we really had, and you actually say that something like this at some point in the book, if I recall, like if we really enhance our brain in a certain way, then we would be able to separate these things out introspectively, and we would be able to say in the flavor experience, there's the taste part and there's the smell component, and that seems, I guess, yeah, to me that seems implausible, at least for flavor, given the way the brain processes that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm committed to is that, you know, in principle, changing the internal sensitivity of the brain could allow us to differentiate elements of our experiential field, you know, arbitrarily finely. A wrinkle is that the changes themselves might transform things to the point where it's no longer the very same experience that we're now having.
Right.
It might be that, you know, the things you have to do to my brain to allow it to, you know, be that sensitive to like individual, maybe, you know, particles, individual molecules, you know, allow me to count the neurotransmitter molecules in a particular synapse. You know, those might change the brain so much that the experience itself is no longer the same flavor that we were having before. It'll be some different flavor. And I will, I guess, fall back on, you know, this is at least a consistent corner of logical space. And I do like this. I forget if it made it into the book, but there's this passage in William James where he says, I find in my students an irresistible tendency to think that the taste experience of tasting lemonade, you know, contains the lemoniness of lemon and the sweetness of sugar.
Yeah, it did make it in the book.
Okay, good. And he says it doesn't at all. It's a completely new and distinctive thing in its own right. You know, the lemonade contains sugar and lemon, but the taste experience does not contain either of these two other taste experiences at all.
Right.
And I guess I'm sort of sitting here like, you know, it sounds like he has many students who, you know, who are very inclined towards thinking of this in blending terms. So, you know, if we're doing this democratically, you know, I'm on the side of the students, and it looks like I outvote William James at least. And maybe you're on his side as well. So there's
a little bit, yeah, exactly, yeah.
And I don't really know, like, what is a good way to resolve this kind of introspective kind of impasse. I guess, you know, yeah, to a certain extent, what I'm like, my model is that something happens to the micro experiences that turns them into the experiences that we have.
But the difficulty
Yeah.
for me is that even if I disagree with you about purple and the lemonade or whatever, conceptually you can see the path.
Right.
But in the case of the micro experiences to red, you can't see the path. It's completely opaque how those things could blend, because like what, I mean, obviously it's inscrutable in some sense. We don't know what they're having, but you gesture towards some things, you know, maybe it's like universal love or, you know, so whatever it is, it's got to be super simple. And it's just not clear how things like that could combine into anything except more complicated things like that, as opposed to a completely unrelated thing like hearing middle C, tasting chocolate, seeing red. Those are very different from me. I mean, I know your Sam Coleman line that maybe they're not so different, which I don't really buy either. But at least prima facie, hearing middle C and seeing red are very distinct. And yet, on your view, they're composed out of the same micro elements. And I just don't see how you get a path from one to the other, except for saying, well, here's some things which combine, so maybe these things too. And that looks like more like a leap than like a principled argument.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to know really like what, you know, what is cheating and what is playing by the rules in this area.
It's philosophy. It's all cheating.
Right. I mean, part of it would be, you know, it may be that these very simple experiences have some degree of internal differentiation, you know, perhaps between like a that and a this, and then maybe the different modes of combination kind of recombine those elements which might be very different from each other and get you, you know, things that are different from each other because of the different ways that they blend those differences. You know, there's people will sometimes point out that, you know, the neurons in auditory cortex and the neurons in visual cortex are the same neurons. They're made of all the same elements.
Right, and they're doing all the same stuff.
Sorry?
And they're doing all the same stuff.
Yeah. But it might be that I think there's no clear reason why there couldn't be relatively higher level differences that allow some tendency or element within that stuff to express itself differently in the one place than in the other.
Right.
Especially, you know, given that what they are doing, you know, even the neurons in like auditory cortex, you know, they're doing that in the context of the rest of the brain. So, you know, it may be that neurons in auditory cortex in isolation would have a different sort of experience than my hearing experiences. But I will freely admit there are definitely kind of gaps in the view that need to be filled, and you know, hopefully it's a contribution, you know, for me to bring out these points of disagreement more clearly, so that we can see, you know, what is really at issue and what would have to be the case.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with that. But I guess the only reason I'm bringing this up is because, you know, the whole point I thought was to try to solve the combination problem. But right at the crucial point, it's like there's a gap. So it doesn't seem like how it solves the combination problem. It suggests this interesting idea about combining minds and inheriting experience, and all that stuff is great, but it doesn't show us how we could a priori derive the experience that you're having from micro experiences, which, as far as I could tell, would be required to solve the combination problem.
Yeah. So I guess on the one hand, I want to insist that I do think that if I mean, this is beyond our capacities as human brains, but if we were able to grasp all of the micro experiences, I actually do think that they would, it's at least a good live option, that it would then be intelligible that the way those elements blend when in the sorts of connections that they're in would turn out to be the sorts of experiences that we have.
Really? So you think you wouldn't be able to get invert cases from, like, you have this very same micro phenomenal properties, but inverted?
No, I don't think so. I think that if you're working with experiential elements, and if you're working with, you know, the qualitativeness that they give you, then I don't think that they would leave wiggle room for changes in the macro experiential qualities,
Yeah.
except insofar as you would have to change the way that they relate to each other, because it's clear that the structure makes a big difference. And maybe, and I feel like what you're pushing on is, you know, maybe the structure would have to make such a big difference that it would kind of break rather than just stretch the different potentialities provided by the micro level. That's possible, but I haven't been convinced of it.
It seems like you could run like a microphenomenal Mary sort of thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
They knew only the microphenomenal properties, and still would be surprised at what it's like to see a tomato when she comes out of her room.
So I guess I do think there's a difference. So, you know, part of what the original Mary case is bringing out is that, you know, if she's learning physical structural facts, any amount of learning that, it doesn't look like it's going to ever get to something qualitative. It looks like it's, you know, it's, you can sort of picture it like on a graph. You know, you've got something here and up on the y dimension, and more physical facts are taking you along the x dimension, but you can go as far as you want in that direction, and it just won't touch the gap. With micro-phenomenal Mary, who's, you know, studying these simple experiences and how they combine, you know, she's studying qualitative facts and how they generate other qualitative facts, how they generate different qualities. And there it looks like it's no longer clear that just doing more and more of that will necessarily get you to, sorry, will never get you to the particular quality of red.
Yeah.
And let me also say, you know, if you're right, I think there's at least potentially a fallback for panpsychists to go for something like what Dave, I think, calls a large palette option.
Right.
On which
that's
there's
like a last ditch effort, right? Where you say every experience we have is present at the phenomenal level, at the micro fundamental level.
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, maybe I guess I mean is a medium palette view, in which there's enough qualitatively distinct elements present at the basic level to blend all the experiences we have out of them.
Right. And there's only a certain amount of particles, and if string theory is right, there's really only one kind. So it does seem like you're going to bump up against some physical facts.
Yeah. And so that's why I prefer a smaller palette, if at all possible. I mean, I think it's not super clear how small the palette is. And so I said earlier, you know, it might be that different energy levels for an electron correspond to changes in experiential quality.
Right.
So, you know, so it might not be the number of particles that matters. It might be something more to do with like the state space of their properties. And, you know,
I mean, isn't this like a problem for the view that there's so much wiggle room here? Because it's like the theory is unconstrained by anything, really. You can basically wiggle it and bend it. You can, in anything. Yeah, well, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 4,000. I mean, there's no principled, there's nothing that's principled which allows you to constrain it at that level.
I mean, I do definitely think that it's a cost making the palette larger. So it's not like it's wiggle room with no costs.
Okay.
And, you know, and overall, like, we're going to have to do like a weighing up the costs and benefits of the views. And I think, you know, every departure from the ideal of full a priori determination from a small palette of simple qualities is going to affect that cost benefit analysis. Yeah, like, I don't know. I mean, is your concern that there's not enough wiggle room, or that there's too much?
Too much.
Yeah.
That there's no principled constraints. You can basically say whatever you want. I mean, maybe they love each other. Maybe they hate each other. Maybe there's one kind. Maybe there's 40 kinds. Maybe every energy state is a kind. Maybe when strings vibrate at certain levels, then that's a different phenomenon. But it just doesn't seem like there's anything which constrains what you're saying here about that microphysical level, which just seems like, well, then, yeah, it's like what's cheating and what's not cheating. Well, you can, like, what?
Yeah, I can see that concern. I mean, I guess it's hard for me to feel too unconstrained, because I do think that, like, certainly once you get above the really basic level and start thinking about, you know, if consciousness is present in the physical fundamentals, what does that mean for the distribution of consciousness and the, you know, of complex consciousness in us? You know, in the book, I end up finding myself constrained towards a lot of, you know, views that even other panpsychists think are undesirable,
Right.
that tables are conscious and so on. So I feel like I'm operating under fairly stringent constraints there.
Right. No, I meant about the palette in particular.
At the palette, at the fundamental level, I mean, yes, there's wiggle room in part because, you know, we don't know what the fundamental physics is like. And also because the view is, you know, accepts a certain degree of mystery to the universe. It accepts that we, you know, just as we don't, you know, consciousness is something where if it's someone else's, you kind of can't understand it fully. You know, you never know what it's quite like to be a bat. And so putting consciousness at the fundamental level does put a certain level of mystery that we won't ever get away from. I think mystery is better than the kind of incomprehensibility that physicalism would have there. And, you know, like you know, is the physicalist in a better position here with, like, generating red rather than some other quality? Like, it's not clear that they are, like, constrained. It's like, it's not clear that the fundamental physics, for instance, is constrained by physicalism, or that they have any principled way of saying, you know, if the fundamental physics, or if, you know, if anything were different, here's the quality that we would experience instead.
Well, I do,
Yeah.
I mean, just not to derail it again, but I do think that there is an a priori deducibility from the physical facts to the phenomenal facts. The stipulation is you need to have the right concepts, right? So Mary needs to have phenomenal concepts and make the deductions. And so she can't do it in her room, obviously, because she doesn't have the right concepts. But I always think that that's a kind of a missing component of that entire debate, which is, of course, she's unfairly constrained. It's like telling her to deduce that water is H2O without knowing what water is. Like, she can't do it, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, she can be told what water is. Like, the concept of water is one that can be communicated, it seems like, in a way that the concept of red can't. So that looks like that's an important difference that kind of cries out for an explanation. Right.
I mean, even there, I think you can. Anyway, so I'm noticing that we're getting well on in the time. I'm supposed to be actually at a seminar here in a little bit. Actually,
oh dear.